Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is really, really important, and that's understanding and managing our emotions.
Absolutely.
Um, this is something that I think a lot of us struggle with,
Yeah.
especially, those of us who may have had some challenging experiences in the past
Right.
that make those emotions feel even more intense.
Yeah. So often we treat emotions as if they're these unwelcome intruders,
Right.
but they're really messengers. They're trying to tell us something really important.
So instead of viewing emotions as the enemy,
Exactly.
we should be thinking of them more as like messengers or guides.
Yeah, think of each emotion as a signal flare, kind of alerting you to something significant that's happening inside.
Interesting.
And instead of labeling them as good or bad, what if we just saw them as valuable data points?
I like that.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's say I'm feeling anxious
right.
instead of just like freaking out and letting that anxiety take over.
Yeah.
I should pause and say, okay, anxiety, what are you trying to tell me here?
Exactly, and the answer might surprise you.
Okay.
Let's take a few common emotions and just kind of break down some of their potential messages.
Okay, I'm game.
Okay, so let's start with sadness.
Right.
What do you think sadness might be signaling?
Well, if I'm feeling sad, it probably means that, you know, I've experienced some kind of loss or disappointment,
Yeah.
or maybe something didn't go the way that I was hoping it would go.
That's a great insight. Yeah, sadness often points to a sense of loss or disappointment or an unmet expectation.
Right?
It kind of invites us to acknowledge what we've lost or what we might be missing.
Okay.
Now, how about anger?
Anger.
What message do you think anger might be trying to convey?
Well, anger feels a lot more charged than sadness.
Yes.
I guess it might be telling me that a boundary has been crossed or that something that I care about has been violated.
Exactly. Anger often signals that a personal boundary has been crossed or a value that we hold dear has been disregarded. And it can be a really powerful motivator to protect ourselves or to stand up for what we believe in.
Interesting. Okay. How about fear?
Fear.
Fear is definitely something I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
I think fear is that feeling I get when I'm about to give a big presentation or something, like a
Yes.
big talk or something.
Yeah.
And I think it's my body's way of telling me like, okay, you need to prepare,
Yeah.
or maybe you're feeling a little bit out of control.
That's a perfect example. Fear often arises when we perceive a threat or a potential danger.
Yeah.
And it can be really helpful in preparing us to face a challenge or prompting us to seek safety.
Okay.
And sometimes it's just highlighting a feeling of powerlessness in a situation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So those three make sense,
Mm-hmm.
but there's one emotion that I've always struggled with, and that's guilt.
Oh, yeah.
Why do we feel guilty, and what's it trying to tell us?
Well, guilt is fascinating because it often arises when our actions don't align with our own internal compass, our own moral code. So it can be a signal that we need to make amends or adjust our behavior to live in greater integrity with our values.
So it's like a reminder to check in with ourselves
Yeah.
and make sure that, we're living in accordance with our own personal sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. Now, here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that people react differently to similar situations.
Oh, absolutely.
Have you noticed that?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, one person might get, super stressed out about a deadline,
Yes.
and another person just like calmly takes it in stride.
Totally. And that's because our past experiences,
Right.
especially those involving, trauma or neglect or other really challenging situations, can profoundly shape how we perceive and respond to things in the present.
Right. And I've heard of this thing called being triggered
Yeah.
by things.
Uh-huh.
What does that really mean?
Well, a trigger is anything, a word, a tone of voice, a particular situation that evokes an intense emotional reaction that seems out of proportion to what's happening in the present moment.
So, like, it doesn't really match.
Yeah, it's as if a part of us gets transported back to that past experience,
Wow.
and we react as if it's happening all over again.
So if someone had a parent who constantly yelled at them,
Right.
hearing a raised voice in the present might trigger those feelings of fear and helplessness,
Yeah,
even if the situation itself isn't actually dangerous.
that's a perfect example. Their reaction isn't really about the present situation so much as it is about the unresolved pain from the past that's being activated.
It's like the past is coming up again.
Exactly.
Okay, this is making me think about how sometimes I avoid certain situations or people because I know they tend to push my buttons.
Right. Well, that's a really common coping mechanism.
Yeah.
But the goal isn't to live in a bubble constantly dodging triggers.
Right.
It's about learning to manage them effectively.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, there are two key strategies.
Okay.
So first, we can learn to diffuse the trigger in the moment.
Okay.
This involves recognizing when it's happening and intentionally choosing a different response.
Okay.
We can try things like taking deep breaths, practicing mindfulness, talking to a supportive friend.
So anything that can help us just interrupt that automatic knee-jerk reaction.
Exactly. And the second strategy is to minimize our exposure to known triggers when possible.
Okay.
So this could mean setting boundaries with certain people,
Right.
limiting time in stressful environments,
Okay.
or even consciously choosing not to engage in topics of conversation that tend to set us off.
This is all starting to feel a lot more actionable.
Good.
Instead of just feeling like I'm at the mercy of my emotions,
Right.
I'm starting to see how I can gain some control here.
That's the shift we want to make.
I like that.
Instead of feeling overwhelmed by our emotions, we can learn to use them as sources of information and growth.
I love that this is all really interesting.
True.
So is there like a practical process we can follow
There is.
to actually manage our emotions in real time?
We call it the 5-step process for healthy emotional management.
Okay.
And I think it can give our listeners a really tangible roadmap to start putting all of this into practice.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's step one?
Step 1 is to identify the emotion.
Okay.
Sounds simple enough, right?
It does.
But it's often trickier than it seems.
I can see that
Yeah,
because, I mean, usually I just say I'm stressed or upset,
right.
but those are pretty vague.
Exactly. Learning to pinpoint the specific emotion you're experiencing is key.
Okay.
Is it sadness, anger, fear, guilt, shame, or something else entirely?
So instead of just reacting, we need to pause and figure out what we're actually feeling.
Exactly. It's about becoming a detective of your own inner world.
I like that.
Yeah, so pay attention to the physical sensations.
Okay.
A racing heart, tightness in your chest, a knot in your stomach.
Right.
Notice your thoughts and behaviors.
Yeah.
Are you withdrawing from others? Are you snapping at people?
So it's like we're gathering clues from our body and our mind to figure out what emotion is at play.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to use those emotions lists we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Sometimes seeing a word like irritated or dejected or overwhelmed
Right.
can help you zero in on that specific feeling.
That's a good tip. And this is making me think about how sometimes people try to mask their true feelings,
Right.
especially if they've been taught that, certain emotions are unacceptable.
Yeah.
So they might, express anger when they're actually feeling hurt, for example.
That's a classic example of how societal expectations and cultural norms can influence how we express our emotions.
Yeah.
But the more we practice tuning into our own inner landscape, the better we become at recognizing and naming those true feelings,
Right.
regardless of external pressures.
It's like getting to know ourselves better.
Absolutely.
Okay, so once we've identified the emotion, what's next?
Step 2 is all about deciphering the message.
Oh.
Remember, emotions are messengers, so we need to figure out what they're trying to tell us.
So if we're feeling anxious, it might be a sign that we're not feeling fully prepared for something,
Yeah.
or that we need to set some boundaries
Right.
in a situation that feels overwhelming.
Exactly. Or if we're feeling resentful,
Yeah.
it might be a sign that we're overextending ourselves and need to prioritize our own needs.
This feels like a whole new way of approaching emotions.
Good.
Instead of just reacting, we're pausing to understand their deeper meaning.
And that's where the real power lies.
Okay?
But we'll delve more into that in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
This is fascinating stuff.
Welcome back to our deep dive on understanding and managing our emotions.
I'm so glad to be back.
Before the break, we were talking about really how to decode the messages that our emotions are sending us.
Right.
And this is really where we move from just simply understanding our emotions to actually using them to create positive change.
Okay, so we've identified the emotion. We've explored its message.
Right.
What's next?
The next step is where things can get a little tricky.
Okay. We need to feel the emotion fully
Really?
without judgment.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I just want those uncomfortable feelings to go away as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I hear you. It's natural to want to avoid or suppress unpleasant emotions.
Yeah.
But the truth is that resistance often makes them stronger.
Okay, so instead of fighting the feeling, we should lean into it.
Yeah, it could feel really counterintuitive,
It does.
but it's incredibly powerful.
Okay.
So imagine your emotions as waves.
Okay.
Instead of trying to swim against the current or frantically build walls to keep them out, allow yourself to just ride them out.
Okay.
Observe the sensations without judgment.
Okay.
Notice how they rise, crest, and eventually subside.
So if I'm feeling overwhelmed by sadness,
Right.
I shouldn't try to push it away or pretend that I'm not sad.
Exactly. Trying to force those feelings down just creates more internal pressure.
Okay.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Right.
It's just going to keep popping back up with even more force.
That makes sense.
But how do we actually do that?
Well,
Like, how do we allow ourselves to experience those intense emotions without getting totally swept away?
mindfulness is a really, really helpful tool here.
Okay.
So find a quiet space,
Okay.
focus on your breath,
Okay.
and simply observe the emotion as it flows through you.
Okay.
Notice the physical sensations without labeling them as good or bad.
Yeah.
Just notice them.
So if I notice like my heart is racing or I have a lump in my throat,
Right.
I don't need to panic.
Exactly.
I can just acknowledge those sensations
Yeah.
and let them be there.
Exactly. You're not trying to change or fix anything.
Right.
You're simply creating space for the emotion to exhale without judgment.
This makes me think about how we often try to distract ourselves from uncomfortable emotions.
Absolutely.
Binge watching Netflix, scrolling through social media,
Yeah.
anything to avoid actually feeling what we're feeling.
And those distractions can provide temporary relief,
Right.
but they don't address the underlying issue.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs stitches.
Exactly.
So by allowing ourselves to fully experience the emotion,
Mm-hmm.
we're actually helping it to dissipate.
Precisely. It's counterintuitive.
It is.
But the more we resist, the more those feelings tend to persist.
Okay.
Allowing ourselves to feel them fully in a mindful and compassionate way actually helps them to move through us.
This is so interesting. Okay, so we've identified the emotion.
Yeah.
We've explored its message,
Mm-hmm.
and we've practiced feeling it without judgment.
Right.
What's next?
The next step is to assess the appropriateness of the emotion.
What do you mean by that?
Well, our emotional responses aren't always perfectly calibrated to the situation at hand,
Right.
especially if past experiences are influencing our reactions.
Right.
We need to ask ourselves, is the intensity of this emotion proportionate to what's actually happening?
Okay, so let's say someone snaps at their partner
Yeah.
because they forgot to take out the trash.
Right.
Their anger might feel justified in the moment. But if they dig a little deeper,
Uh-huh.
they might realize that their reaction is actually stemming from a deeper fear of feeling unimportant or uncared for.
That's a great example.
Okay.
It's not about invalidating their feelings, but rather understanding the context
Right.
and considering whether other factors might be at play.
So it's like a reality check.
Exactly.
We're pausing to ask ourselves, is this reaction truly about the current situation,
Yeah.
or is it being amplified by something else?
Exactly. And this leads us to the final and most important step,
Okay.
taking action.
Okay, this is where we actually get to do something with all of these insights we've gathered.
Exactly, based on the messages your emotions have revealed.
Right.
You can now take proactive steps to create positive change.
Okay.
And to do that, we ask ourselves 3 key questions.
Ooh, I love a good framework.
Yeah.
Lay it on me. What are the questions?
So the first question is, do I need to change my perception of the situation?
So sometimes our emotional reactions are based on like misinterpretations or assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. We might be jumping to conclusions.
Right.
Or seeing things through a lens of past experiences.
Okay, so going back to that example of the person snapping at their partner about the trash,
Right.
they might realize upon reflection that their partner isn't actually trying to disrespect them.
Right.
They were just distracted.
Yeah.
Or they simply forgot.
That's a great example.
Okay.
By adjusting our perception, we can often diffuse the intensity of the emotion and avoid unnecessary conflict.
But what if, after honest reflection,
Yeah.
we determine that our perception is accurate?
Right.
What if our emotional reaction is
Whoop.
valid
Uh-huh.
and we need something to change?
That's where the second question comes in.
Okay.
Do I need to communicate my needs and feelings?
So if I'm feeling hurt
Yeah.
because my friend canceled our plans at the last minute,
Right?
I shouldn't just bottle up those feelings and pretend like I'm not bothered.
Exactly. We often expect people to just know what we're thinking or feeling.
Right.
But clear and compassionate communication is essential for healthy relationships.
This reminds me of how many couples struggle
Yeah.
with, assuming their partner should just know what they're thinking or feeling.
It's a common trap.
Yeah.
But remember, even the most loving and well-intentioned people
Right.
can't meet our needs if they don't know what they are.
So in this case, we might gently explain to our friend how much we were looking forward to seeing them
Yeah.
and how their last-minute cancellation made us feel disappointed.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
notice how that communication style is different from blaming or accusing.
Right.
It's about expressing our needs vulnerably
Yeah.
and inviting the other person to understand our perspective.
Okay, but what happens if we've communicated our needs clearly
Uh-huh.
and the other person's behavior hasn't changed?
Right.
What if those needs are still not being met?
That's when we ask ourselves the third and final question.
Okay.
Do I need to behave differently to achieve different results?
So sometimes we need to look at our own role in the dynamic.
Exactly. We might be unintentionally reinforcing the very behaviors we want to change.
Okay, so if we're constantly complaining or nagging our partner to do something,
Right.
they might become defensive and even less likely to cooperate.
Precisely.
Okay,
By shifting our own communication style, perhaps focusing on expressing appreciation,
right.
when they do make an effort, we can create a more positive and collaborative dynamic.
This whole process is really highlighting the power of taking ownership of our emotions
Yes.
rather than just blaming others for how we feel.
It's about recognizing that we're not passive victims of our circumstances.
Right.
We have the power to choose how we respond, and that's incredibly empowering.
I love that it takes the focus off of trying to control other people
Yeah.
and puts it back on what we can actually control ourselves.
And that's where true transformation happens. But remember,
Sure.
learning to manage our emotions is an ongoing process.
It is.
There will be setbacks and challenges along the way.
Of course.
The key is to approach this journey with self-compassion
Right.
and a willingness to keep learning and growing.
This has been so insightful. I feel like we've covered so much ground already.
Me too.
Are there any common pitfalls that people encounter when they try to put these principles into practice?
Welcome back to our deep dive.
We're back.
We've been talking about really understanding our emotions and how managing those emotions can really create a fulfilling life.
Right, and I think last time we left off talking about triggers.
We did.
So can we dig a little deeper into that?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's so important to understand, especially for individuals who find themselves reacting in ways that seem really out of proportion to what's happening.
Right, like it just doesn't match.
Yeah, it's bigger than what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a trigger is essentially anything that evokes that kind of intense emotional reaction that feels bigger than the situation
Wow.
warrants, right?
Totally. And it could be a word, a tone of voice, a particular situation, even a sensory experience like a smell or a sound that transports us back to that experience of hurt, fear, or shame.
It's like our nervous system gets hijacked by that past experience. And suddenly we're back in that, childlike state of feeling overwhelmed and threatened,
Right.
even though in our logical mind we know it's not actually dangerous.
Your body and mind are trying to protect you from reliving that past pain.
Okay.
But in doing so, they might overreact or behave in ways that don't really serve you in the present.
This makes me think about how many of us are walking around with these invisible wounds from our past that we don't even realize are shaping
Yes.
our reactions and relationships.
That's why awareness is so crucial.
Yeah.
That first step to healing is really just starting to notice those triggers.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, you ask yourself, what are the specific situations or people
Yeah.
or even words or phrases that evoke those really intense responses?
Okay, so for example, if I'm noticing a pattern
Yeah.
that every time my boss gives me feedback, I get really defensive or anxious,
Right.
that could be a sign that something's up.
Yeah, it might be worth exploring whether past experiences with criticism
Right.
or feeling judged have created a trigger for you.
Right. Or if I'm noticing that I'm feeling, angry or I shut down
Yeah.
when my partner forgets to do something I've asked them to do.
Right.
Maybe there's something deeper there.
Yeah, it could be helpful to examine whether that triggers those feelings of being unimportant or uncared for from past relationships.
Interesting. Okay, so once we start to notice those patterns, what do we do with that awareness?
Once you've identified your triggers, you can start to develop strategies for managing them.
Okay.
And this isn't about avoiding those triggers altogether, but learning to navigate them with more skill and awareness.
So it's like we can't live in a bubble.
Right.
We have to learn how to deal with them.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some effective strategies for managing those triggers when they do arise?
Well, one of the most powerful tools we have is mindfulness.
Okay.
By practicing mindfulness techniques, we can train ourselves to observe those intense emotions
Right.
and physical sensations without getting completely swept away by them.
So can you give me an example of what that might look like in practice?
Absolutely. One really simple but effective mindfulness technique is to focus on your breath.
Okay.
So when you notice yourself feeling triggered,
Uh,
just take a few slow, deep breaths and pay attention to the sensation of the air moving in and out of your body.
I notice when I'm anxious, I take those short, shallow breaths.
Right.
They make me feel even more panicky.
Yes, intentionally slowing down your breathing can really shift that physiological response.
That's a good tip.
Okay. What else? Another really helpful mindfulness practice is to simply notice those physical sensations that arise when you're triggered
Okay.
without judgment.
So like the tightness in my chest.
Yeah, tightness in your chest, racing heart, a knot in your stomach.
Okay.
Just notice those sensations and acknowledge that they're present without trying to change them or make them go away.
So it's like saying, okay, I notice my heart is racing. That's interesting. I'm not going to freak out about it. I'm just going to observe it.
Exactly.
Curiosity.
It sounds simple, but it can be so powerful.
Yeah.
By shifting your attention from the story you're telling yourself about the situation to the actual physical sensations, you can create some distance.
Okay.
And that distance can help prevent you from getting completely swept away.
This reminds me of what we were talking about earlier about allowing ourselves to feel the emotions.
Yeah.
And not suppressing them.
Right.
It sounds like mindfulness can be a helpful tool to do that in a safe and controlled way.
Absolutely. Another helpful strategy for managing triggers is to challenge those negative thoughts
Okay.
that often accompany those intense emotions.
So the thoughts like, I'm not good enough.
Right. Or I'm going to mess this up.
Yeah.
You can pause and ask yourself, is this thought really true?
Is there another way to look at it?
Exactly. So ask yourself, what's the evidence for this thought?
Right.
What's the evidence against it? What would I say to a friend who was having this thought?
That's a really good point because we're often so much more compassionate to our friends
Yes.
than we are to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So applying that same kindness and objectivity to our own thoughts can be incredibly helpful.
Okay, and sometimes managing these triggers means setting boundaries with the people or situations
Yes.
that are activating those unhealthy patterns.
Right.
That can be tricky, especially if it's family or close friends.
It can be, but setting healthy boundaries is essential for emotional well-being.
Yeah.
And this might look like limiting contact with certain people, declining invitations to events that, will be stressful,
Okay.
or even just ending relationships that are consistently triggering and unhealthy for you.
And I imagine saying no to people we care about can be really difficult.
It can be, but it's important to remember that setting those boundaries isn't selfish.
Right.
It's about prioritizing your own well-being and creating a life that feels safe and supportive.
This makes me think about the importance of self-care,
Yes.
especially when we're working through past traumas or navigating those difficult relationships.
Self-care is essential. It's about creating that foundation of emotional well-being.
Yeah.
So you're better equipped to handle those challenges.
So things like getting enough sleep, eating, nourishing foods, moving our bodies, spending time in nature, those aren't just luxuries.
Right. They're essential.
They're essential for our emotional well-being.
Yeah. And don't underestimate the power of connection.
Yeah.
Having those supportive relationships, whether it's with friends, family, a therapist, a support group, can make a world of difference.
I think knowing that we're not alone
Yeah,
can be so validating and empowering.
absolutely.
Well, this whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
I agree.
I feel like I have a whole new perspective on how to understand and manage my emotions, and I hope our listeners do too.
Me too.
So to you listening, remember, you are not defined by your past experiences or your emotional reactions. You have the power to choose how you respond. And by approaching your emotions with curiosity and compassion, you can cultivate greater resilience, build stronger relationships, and create a life that feels more authentic and aligned with your values.
Beautifully said.
Until next time, keep diving deep.